Good evening and delighted to meet you. I think this is our first meeting. I haven't met you earlier, but your predecessors I have met and spoken with them. I had long discussions. I think from you, what I would like to hear, and therefore our viewers too, is that government does not create growth. It only enables growth. The growth creators are companies like yourselves, all the large corporations, the small and medium-sized businesses, and such like. That's where they are the people who create growth. Again, growth happens in states rather than in New Delhi. Most of the policies that we talk about are carved out in Delhi, but their extensions, their expressions happen in corporate houses like yours. What is your personal view? Now, we've asked this question to the government people about, living in a time of disruption. First, we had the technological disruption. Then we had the COVID crisis, the pandemic disruption. Now we are undergoing a geopolitical disruption. These disruptions are here to stay. How does Tata Steel engage with these disruptions? How does it come out as a winner? How does it overcome these challenges? I think that's where growth, the growth story really lies.
Gautam, what happens is in corporates, we have, and particularly in Tata Steel, we have very strong processes to look at risks, the way risks emerge and how do you plan to mitigate them and how do you plan to respond to them. And organizations need to be agile to respond to what's happening. So while you said the government doesn't create growth, but government has a big role to play in creating the conditions for growth. Like I said, if the government spends more on infrastructure, that creates growth opportunities for companies like us, for construction companies, for services companies, for people who provide materials like us. So there is a role that government has to play. The second thing is, there is a lot that industry can do within the gates of the factories that we operate in and drive competitiveness and quality. But a lot of that competitiveness negated outside of the factory gates, and that's again a place where government can play a role. As far as organizations go, we always, and if I take the Tata Steel example, we've had a few good quarters, we've had a couple of good years, because we responded in a very agile way to the pandemic. Not only did we take care of the communities who were impacted and who we live in the midst of, but also we did a lot of work on our business. We were already in the middle of a digital transformation, which helped us to migrate from a work from office to work from home very seamlessly. China was the first country to recover from the pandemic, and we saw an opportunity to export steel to China, which was unheard of maybe a few years back, where we were worried about China exporting steel into India. So not just Tata Steel, the Indian steel industry exported a lot of steel to China, and that helped us come out even when the Indian demand was quite tepid. And similarly, even now, we are responding to what's emerging as a very major crisis in Europe, because not only do we have a footprint in India, we have a footprint in Europe as well. And we are responding to what's happening. So I think organizations are agile. Organizations respond quickly to crisis. Organizations look at turning a crisis into an opportunity. And I think in today's day and age, governments also need to be more agile if they have to respond to crises.
So just one comment here. I think the infrastructure part, the government has said that they will be leading the capital investment with 1 lakh crore of investment. That's what Nirmala Sitharamanji announced in the budget. So I think that part is taken care of. The second part, when you mentioned risk management, I just want to ask a very straight question. It need not be very long. Is that, has your risk management team, is your risk management department increased over the last 5 years? More than what it had in the past? Is Tata Steel looking at risk more carefully today than it did earlier?
We started this journey about 6-7 years back. But I think the way we measure our success in risk management is, does the business drive the risk management process? There are experts at the corporate level who help the business understand how to run the risk management process. And ultimately, it has to be the business who owns it and drives it.
Have the number of people increased in this department, or is it the same?
Not in the department, but I think the risk maturity of the organization, because a typical business leader in Tata Steel has a much greater appreciation of risk today than he or she had 5-6 years back. So that's how we look at the maturity of the organization, rather than have a small group of specialists or a big group of specialists running it.
Okay. Coming to slightly, let's look at people who feed into you. How are they performing vis-a-vis larger companies? I don't want to take Tata Steel specifically, but Tata Steel is a large conglomerate into which several vendors feed. And do you see them going through a similar problem? Have they been able to manage the stress? I ask this question because on the other side of the spectrum, we have 40 billion-dollar companies that came out from India last year, and that the goal is to have those 100 unicorns in this year. So there is something happening at the back end. You are a manufacturer, not a service person. Hence, just asking this question: are your vendors or the suppliers, etc., managing to go through this crisis with ease?
So, if I were to define it beyond our vendors, I think the MSME sector has struggled quite a bit in this crisis for multiple reasons. There is also a formalization of the economy which has impacted many of them. But more specifically, our vendors are very aligned with us. We help them if they need help. They also are growing with us because we have doubled in India in the last 10 years and will double in the next 10 years. So there's a lot of growth happening in Tata Steel, and many of our vendors are participating in that growth. We work quite closely and seamlessly with our vendors so that whatever we do, they also learn to do it, whether it's on having a response, on sustainability or on digital transformation. Many of our vendors are participating in that process so that they keep upgrading themselves just as we upgrade ourselves. So I think our vendors are okay, but I can't say the same of all the MSMEs who are out there. I think many have struggled. And I think with rising input costs, many are struggling on working capital as well.
You mentioned that you've begun to export to China, and I'm presuming you're already exporting to some other countries and importing from there as well. Have the supply chains been very drastically disrupted as the normal narrative goes? Or, tell us the ground view.
So, 2 years back, when China recovered faster than everybody else, there was a great opportunity to export to China, which we did, in a very big way. And after that, as the rest of the world also picked up after the pandemic, including India, we did not feel the need to export to China as much as we did then. So today we export about 10 to 15% of what we produce. It goes into Southeast Asia, it goes into Europe, and to the Middle East. From Europe, we export into the US. So we pretty much export to many countries across the world. Supply chains have been disrupted, not only for us, but more importantly for many of our customers. I think the automotive supply chain is still struggling to come out of the semiconductor issue. Many of our customers have struggled because of the shortage in containers, and container freight rates have gone up over the last year. And just now what's happening is Russia and Ukraine account for a very high percentage of many critical inputs for the industrial processes, including steel, So also, some of the gases used in manufacturing semiconductors, also in other metals like nickel, etc. So there is a lot of disruption. And I think the world is realizing that in a fully integrated environment like we have today, everyone is exposed to what happens across the world. You cannot assume that something which happens in some corner of the world won't impact you indirectly or directly. It has an impact on you or your value chain that you're part of. So we're seeing that happen across. And we need to find ways to de-risk ourselves from this exposure.
So, do you see alternative supply chains developing, and if so, by when do you see a new normal coming up? I ask this question more in context of this geopolitical disruption, which is again breaking the world into globalizing and self-sufficiency within. You're trying to do as much as you can within. India has 40% of its GDP in trade. So India doesn't have that kind of luxury to step back from globalization without harming itself. So these new supply chains that are developing, will they remain trans-global, transnational, or do you see some domestic or regional supply chains also coming up?
So I think multiple things are going to happen. One is everyone is going to look at mitigating the risk by having more than one source. So if earlier you were sourcing from China, you look at China plus one, right? So and across the world, companies are doing that, including Tata Steel. So you're looking at other options beyond China if it's more expensive. Secondly, if you're looking at things that you're importing, you're looking at how can you indigenize, because that reduces the risk. And the pandemic has shown us that it's not even enough to indigenize, because if you had a supplier in Maharashtra and you needed it in Jharkhand, because of the pandemic, material was not moving. So we are also looking at not just indigenization, but we are looking at how can we localize as much as possible. So I think there are different degrees of risk mitigation that's happening to make sure that you are not vulnerable or exposed as much as we've been over the last few years. So I think you're going to see supply chains being reconstructed very significantly.
Then we come to technology. India still relies on imported steel for the high-tech usage. Is Tata Steel planning new diversifications or expansions into this high-tech steel? For a long time, India still is not, and I'm not talking Tata Steel specifically, India. For a long time, India is not part of this high-end steel making.
I think that's a myth which has been perpetuated. I don't agree with that. 95% of the steel imported into India is very basic commodity grades imported for commercial reasons, not for technical reasons. Okay, Indian steel industry, including Tata Steel, today produces pretty much all the high-end steels that are required to be used by the country, very small quantities, which are typically not produced not for technical reasons, but because it's not viable to produce some very small quantity of something, may get imported from somewhere. I think the industry is strong. We've invested hugely in technology. I'm not saying we are the best, but we certainly have the facilities to make, and we are investing in a lot of R&D over the last few years, not just Tata Steel, all of us. And I think India shouldn't have a problem about having to import high-end steel. There are some categories of steel which are coming, but not an issue.
Commodities.
Just to give you a sense, Tata Steel alone has a 55% share of market of the auto industry in India.
Oh, wow. That's heartening to hear. Commodity cycle is again turning because of because of Ukraine in the short term, and you're going to have a very good year in your balance sheet this year. But do you see this sustaining?
I think may not be at today's levels because today's prices are all over the place because of the perceived risk of the Ukraine conflict. But certainly what has changed in the last decade is, so if you look at the period between 2000 and 2010 when China was growing very fast, China in some sense was importing a lot of commodities and leading to a commodity prices staying high. Between 2010 and 20 when China slowed down a bit and had built enough capacity, they started exporting a lot of commodities and which depressed the prices. I think China is no longer keen to export commodities like they did in the last decade. And so I expect commodity prices this decade to be closer to what we saw between 2000 and 2010 than between 2010 and 2020. But it will be volatile because the globe is far more integrated today than it was 10, 15 years back. So, local events will have a global impact.
Okay, so last closing remarks for you. What is it that you need? What does India, not you, Tata Steel specifically, but let's say Indian manufacturing, what does it need in order to grow at, let us say, 15% CAGR?
So I think the cost of doing business needs to be worked on. Here, the governments have to play a role both at the center and the state. The ease of doing business has to be worked on because in India, we take a lot more time than in other countries to set up facilities, etc. And that's expensive because the cost of money is expensive in India. The Indian industry needs to invest in R&D, in technology, in skilling, because I think while we pay a premium for education, we don't pay enough premium for good skills. I think that needs to come into place from the government policy stability, because when you're looking at investments, putting in capital on the ground by domestic investors and foreign investors, they look for policy stability. And again, here, the center and the states have to work together because oftentimes it's the operating level is at the state. So while the policy may be at the center, changes in governments at the state level should not disrupt policy which hampers investment. So I think these are the things that we look for. India is a large market, and we have the opportunity to scale up in India. We have the opportunity to build quality and competitiveness in India. We are blessed with many things and we need to leverage that.
So predictability and ease of doing business is what you would be seeking. Thank you very much, Mr. Narendran. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.